You know, it's a remarkable time that we're living in. Really, just in the last couple years, I've noticed that probably once every 2 weeks when I go on my computer and want to check what's happening in the news, it's so awful, I just have to turn it off. But it's also a remarkable time in that there is an explosion in the desire for people to want to learn to meditate and our understanding of what meditation can offer, both physiologically and psychologically, but medically as well. So we're going to take a little tour of this process of meditation. We'll consider it a guided neuroplasticity technique. Very nice way to put it. One of the things I'll often talk to people about when we get into the topic of neuroplasticity and the changeability of the brain is, who do you want to be in 6 months? Because the truth is, 6 months from now, you will be different than you are right now. You will be a slightly different version. So right now I may be Peter Van Houten version 66.1 right now, but in 6 months, I'm going to be 66.7. So time has passed, my body has changed, my brain and nervous system has changed. And I really have one choice, and that is, do I want to be in charge of that process? Do I want to guide that process so that that outcome will be one that I really want, and that I'm working towards someone I would like to be? The number of studies on meditation has literally exploded in the last 5 years. In fact, it's curious, I was just looking through this morning, that if you look all the way back to the early 1970s, I was working in this little research lab down in UC Irvine. It was part of the Benson studies on the relaxation response. We were doing one little aspect of it. That really from the early 1970s all the way up to about 2005, the number of research studies coming out about meditation was staying fairly level at a little under 200, and would sort of wobble around a little bit, but stayed very even. There really was not that much happening. I know I was often very disappointed that some of my favorite authors in the field of meditation research would publish books very infrequently. So I was always very thirsty when these would come out. Well, in 2005, a shift began occurring. And in fact, the number of studies being done each year began going up very rapidly. And in fact, what's happened now, here we are 10, 12 years later, it's well over 1,000 a year, and the increase is what we call exponential. The rate at which they're increasing is getting steeper. So it kind of goes like this for all these years, 30 years. And this went right through the period where we understood that the brain is changeable. That was about 1980. And boy, meditation is actually changing our brain structure and function. I would have thought there would have been a huge peak right there. Nope, just kind of cooked right along. Here about 2005 starts to increase. And now all of a sudden, there's this exponential increase. And it's easy, for example, to find meditation applications for your iPhone or your computer, where you can actually have an interactive application to work with you on your meditation. In our experience in our medical practice in 2004, we realized that there was this whole underserved population of people who are having behavioral health issues and substance use issues. About 2/3 of the patients I see are indigent. Quite a few are homeless, or they have very significant social problems as well as health problems and behavioral health problems. And we were feeling really at the limit of our competency to help them. We were really looking for a new kind of model. And so we went out and actually got training in how to work with psychotherapists, therapists who would actually work right next to us in our medical practice, where we'd be throughout the day just interacting back and forth with the therapist, handing people off to them who needed additional help, more emotional mechanic help than we would have time or the competency to actually do. So we had this one little increase with that. We've sort of digested that and made that a key component of our practice. And lo and behold, just in the last year, suddenly the interest of actually having meditation taught regularly in medical practice has exploded. We were actually doing this, our therapists were doing it, we were doing it as medical providers. Often we teach a very simple pranayama or breath control technique. If I was in with a patient who was anxious, I could do something very simple with them and say, okay, I just want you to breathe with me. Just follow. I'm inhale when I go like this, exhale when I do like that, and just follow me. And I just have them inhale to a count of 3, hold to 1, exhale to a count of 3. And maybe gradually extend that over a minute or two. Very brief intervention, and I'd correct them. You've got to breathe with your stomach. In fact, I'd often have them either put both hands on their stomach, and I still have patients, here 14, 15 years later, that'll come in and I'll sit down in the room with them and they'll put their hands on their stomach and they'll say, I can still make my hands move, Because for a lot of them, there was a foreign concept to breathe diaphragmatically in this much more beneficial way. If we go back to the year 2004, one of the dilemmas we had around the whole psychotherapy or therapy issue is that when you looked at the kind of research being done on therapy in a medical setting, because one of the first questions I asked, maybe the one you would ask in that setting, is, well, okay, there's lots of different kinds of therapy. Everything from primal scream to more traditional Jungian therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy, all these different therapy types. Which is the best? And back in 2004, I remember asking our mentors, who were kind of the best people in the United States in this, and they say, well, we really don't know. Most of the studies at this point have been done in a collective manner where they'll just take all these different kinds of psychotherapy practices, put them together in a large metadata pool, and kind of look at the collective results. And so I would say, well, does that mean you really can't tell me whether this therapy is better than that therapy? And they say, well, not really yet. Well, actually, very interesting, in the last 13 years, much of that has really sifted out. In fact, one of my mentors very recently said, if anybody ever asks you what kind of therapy they should get, just start with cognitive behavioral therapy. That's always really safe. Cognitive behavioral therapy looks very much like the way we would work with individuals who want to make progress in their personal life here in yoga. It's very aspirationally based. It works with affirmations and trying to reframe your thinking in a much more positive direction. Well, as quickly as that's happened, we're still in that same kind of dilemma right now with meditation, because as you saw from the lectures we've had so far today, that a lot of them are done on kind of collected studies where there are several different meditation types that are being looked at. And in fact, they're just beginning to tease out how different kinds of meditation affect the brain and body in slightly subtle ways, slightly different ways. Well, what are some things that we know that we can at least say more broadly? Well, the first one is, how much do you need to meditate to get some benefit? This is something I get asked by my patients frequently. And by the way, just this year, we got a very nice grant. It's about a $200,000 grant to let us add a meditation teacher so that we could integrate it in, set up our system. So basically, we're going to try to teach everybody to meditate. If you've got a pain problem, if you've got a chronic illness of any sort, particularly the inflammatory ones like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, all these things that may be inflammation related, meditation is the perfect anti-inflammatory, and it's safe. So it's one that we can begin teaching everybody. We were kind of doing that on the sly with our therapists. In fact, at one point, I asked one of our therapists, what percentage of our patients are we teaching to meditate when you take them back and, spend your 30 or so minutes with them? And she said, well, it's probably right around 80%, which I was actually very pleased to hear that she was able to get that many people started on some simple meditation, usually one of these simple breathing techniques. Well, now we're going to have practitioners that's what they do, where again, we're kind of seeing this as a very robust time for the expansion of meditation. That's why I was just so delighted to see that Ananda has a meditation application for the iPhone and computer so that people can get access to this and it'll be out there so broadly. Well, how much should people meditate? Well, that's actually been studied. A good minimum to begin getting cumulative effects, not just sort of immediate effects, but some ongoing cumulative effects. Looks like it's right around 12 to 15 minutes for a minimum. I liked what Dr. Shanti said earlier of recommending 20 minutes. I think that's a real good base. And I think you could probably even qualify that by saying, well, if you're in a pinch, you can meditate a little bit less, but always try to keep it to 20 and then hope they get 15. Not a bad idea. But I also tell people, remember, even 2 or 3 minutes can be helpful in an acute situation because, yes, you're going to get this ongoing benefit from sitting regularly, at least once a day for 12 to 15 minutes. But if you find yourself in a stressful situation, you can do something immediately for 2 or 3 minutes, which will greatly help calm you down, let you stay focused, let you work more within your normal limits of who you are as a person without getting thrown off center. Now, it's kind of interesting, the books that are coming out right now, they're actually talking about not only naive meditators, but the naive meditator is someone who's just started, but long-term meditators. And I was really a little struck by this. They consider a long-term meditator is someone who's logged about 1,000 hours of meditation time. Well, that's an hour a day for 3 years. And they consider you a long-term meditator. In fact, kind of their really strong veteran meditators were about 9,000 or 10,000 hours. And they even had 1 or 2 hero meditators who'd logged upwards of 27,000 hours. Well, if you meditate 2 hours a day for 40 years, and frankly, there's people in this room, they probably have. That's 28,000 hours. So they're studying these lamas who've done all this meditation and they've logged 27,000 hours, where there's people like that right here in this room right now who've logged that much or will log that much in their lifetime easily. So all that to say is, even for some of the most profound changes that we see coming from meditation, it's not requiring that you meditate 8 hours a day, 365 days a year, that many of these benefits are coming from really much more doable amounts. I mean, the thought of meditating 2 hours a day is at least a possibility for most people. The second thing that's been shown is that it's possible to have really abrupt positive changes in your neurochemistry. I know this is something probably everyone is aware of, that if you go through a very negative experience, you happen to be walking down the street and just happen to see a a scene of violence. There's a car accident that happens right in front of you, and for weeks afterwards, you can still kind of feel the echoes in your nervous system of the distress of being a part of that situation. We've known that those things can happen very abruptly. What we didn't know is whether the flip side was true, whether it was possible to have very positive experiences, the kind one might have in meditation as an epiphany, and would that actually make a positive change that would also be persistent and would continue to echo into the future as part of your nervous system? The answer is yes. So one thing I recommend to people, particularly if you're a long-time meditator, you've been meditating more than 3 years regularly, is, be meditating with a sense of anticipation, because you don't know what is going to happen for the good and how soon that may happen. And as much as you may feel you are struggling right now with your meditation, we have really good evidence to show that people sometimes make fairly significant leaps in how their neurological function, how their neurochemistry works from their meditation, but it doesn't happen in just a linear fashion. Sometimes there are these upward spikes that can occur and then seem to continue with a change in function. This has actually been verified with functional MRI, showing us that these things can occur. Paramahansa Yogananda said a very interesting thing in his interpretation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I remember I first saw this in about 1980. He said, for every human being, their road to God is through their own nervous system. And I thought, finally, this makes sense. Because I'd always felt that we're all spiritual snowflakes. We all have a unique experience of returning home to God. And suddenly, he put it in a context where it made perfect sense. All of us have totally unique nervous systems. Even if we're biological twins with another person and have had almost identical experiences throughout our lives, we're still going to be neurologically unique. And what Yogananda was getting at is it doesn't really matter what your outward religion is, that for all of us, the key core component of our inward religion is our nervous system and this gradual transformation into a state where we're able to manifest great saintly qualities. They're trying to break down the different types of meditation and studies into 3 general areas right now. I'm just mentioning this. I'm not even sure these are the best ones to choose, but I kind of want to let you know this is the way the people in research are looking at it. One are the attention type meditations, particularly ones where you're focused here in the prefrontal cortex or the prefrontal lobes of the brain. The second are what they call the constructive meditations. This would be a meditation, for example, a Buddhist empathy meditation where you're really meditating on developing empathy. And then there's the deconstructive meditations. I don't know where they got these terms, which would be more like mindfulness. So as you see those terms, that's what they are basically trying to do, is to split those so we have a way of identifying them. Well, how does our brain change on a cellular level when we meditate? Well, one way you can think about it is this is a form of guided neuroplasticity we're taking advantage of, that the brain loves to change. Remember, you can just go back to 1980, and if you talk to a group of neuroscientists and said the brain is changeable after age 25, they'd probably, if they didn't laugh at you, they'd say, okay, what's the joke? What's the punchline? Because your brain didn't change after age 25. It's actually a pretty grim point. And I remember 1980 was about the point that I read that quote from Yogananda saying, the road to God is through your own nervous system, is right at that point where, guess what? Your nervous system is changeable. And people in their 80s are making new neurons. There's probably at least a few 80-year-olds here who are going to smile. That we're still making new neurons at age 80. Second way it's changeable or plastic is that when we start using our brain in a specific way, in our discussion today, we're talking about meditation. For example, we're going to see an explosion of neural interconnections in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the PFC, or prefrontal lobes. And lastly, there's actually a process of retasking or recruitment that can occur. So you may have cells that are part of another committee in your brain working on a different task, and your brain can actually call on those cells to retask and take over a different kind of function. So that's not a small thing. Again, if you go back recently as 1980, neuroscientists felt very strongly that when a cell made its final decision on what it was going to do, it could not be retasked. And now we see that they're actually quite a bit more flexible in the kinds of jobs that they do, that they're actually able to restructure in a way that lets them change and do other things that are needed. Well, let's talk about the specific areas in the brain, and there's several that I'd like to talk about. We've already talked a little bit about the prefrontal cortex. Let me hold up my brain model here. Okay. So I'm just holding this brain sort of the way my brain is oriented. And when we talk about the prefrontal cortex, we're talking about the part of the cortex sort of from this point forward. So it's the most anterior 1.5 or 2 inches of the brain, okay? There's a second area I'd like to point out, and that's sort of right in here. And this little area right here, just where my fingers are, this is the anterior cingulate gyrus. Or I wish it had a simpler name. It doesn't. You'll see it in studies as the ACC, but it's anterior cingulate gyrus. Sometimes they'll just call it the anterior cingulate. Now I'm going to take the outer part of the brain off here. In fact, this is the much more elegant part of the brain here, much more highly developed. And that little area I pointed out here, the anterior cingulate, you'll only find that particular type of neuron or cell in primates and humans. It's unique to more evolved creatures like primates and humans. Let me take off the outer part of the brain. Okay, and I'm just holding it up the same way again. But this time, we're seeing a very primitive portion of the brain, and this is the limbic system. You can see it's sort of C-shaped, shaped sort of like a half moon or a limbus. In fact, you have to remember all the structures in the brain were named by anatomists long before they had any idea of what they did. So they kind of went by what things looked like. So this is the limbic system, shaped like a half moon. And out here on either side, there's 2 little structures called the hippocampus. You've probably heard of that before. It's related to memory and your ability to find yourself in 3-dimensional space. Well, those structures, someone decided they looked like a seahorse, and that's why they're called hippocampus. I'm not making this up. There's an area right here on kind of the front part of the limbic system called the insula. The insula just means island, and it's a little island of tissue here that's very important. I would like to go through those 4 areas we just talked about: the prefrontal lobes, the insula, the limbic system, and the anterior cingulate. Prefrontal lobes critical to our spiritual development. It turns out this is the part of our brain that is the controller of our ability to learn or be creative. In fact, that's one of the common things you'll hear from people when they first start meditating is they'll find learning is easier or they find they're much more creative. It's also the part of our brain that's associated with our sense of humor. In fact, I remember back in the early 1970s when I was first taking part in a study where we were dealing with veteran meditators, that was one of the things that really struck me is they all seemed to just have a fabulous sense of humor. I'd be sticking needles in their arms trying to get their blood, and the blood would squirt out, and I'd go, oh no, and they'd think it was hilarious. And I was really struck by that, because it didn't seem to matter what we did right or wrong, that they were just happy to be part of it. It's also the part of the brain that is concerned with our ability to get along harmoniously with other people. So often you'll find in a community like Ananda village here, where we have several hundred people living in close quarters, it's surprising how harmonious it is. And part of the reason is everyone meditates. It's also the part of the brain that is associated with our level of happiness and our baseline level of happiness. So we'll all have some up and downs day to day in happy and sadness, but kind of our basic resting tone of happiness is really being set by what's happening in the prefrontal cortex. Now, the anterior cingulate, remember that's just a little bit behind the prefrontal cortex, is related to empathy, moral judgment, impulse control, and social awareness. It's a very key area, and for example, when they have done studies on Buddhists doing empathy-type meditation, they see the anterior cingulate really being lit up by that practice, really showing that empathic-type meditation or meditating on kindness affects that important structure in the brain. The limbic system, including the insula, remember I held that up and showed it to you, that's where our autonomic nervous system connects. It's concerned with our sense of individuality as knowing that I am separate and you are threatening my space. This is something that is an insula limbic system function. And it's the area of the brain that we try to put things in emotional context. It's also concerned with much more primitive emotions, particularly if we include the attendant structures to the limbic system, which would include the amygdala, that they're also concerned with very primitive emotions like anger, rage, fear. As far as our neurochemistry, there's two neurotransmitters that I think are worth mentioning because they are definitely affected by regular meditation. One is serotonin. Serotonin is the rest and fulfillment hormone. In our medical practice, if I see someone who's profoundly depressed, we will often start by giving them a medication to help them start feeling better, even before we start with any kind of therapy, to help them in addition. And even if it's not going to be our long-term solution for them, we'll at least start with that because it begins to raise the serotonin levels, particularly in the prefrontal lobes of the brain. And you can actually see this on functional MRIs, that before treatment, their prefrontal lobes look asleep. 6 weeks later, you take that same patient and look at the change in their brain, and their prefrontal lobes are suddenly lighting up and beginning to look much more normal. And in fact, the change in their prefrontal lobe on the MRI actually is happening faster than their subjective symptoms. So the patient actually shows improvement on their functional MRI, even before symptomatically they're getting better. Meditating regularly actually has much of that same effect of increasing serotonin levels in the prefrontal lobes of the brain. Another one of the neurotransmitters that I think has a real place for discussion right now is dopamine. That's our risk and reward neurotransmitter in our brain. And so someone who just loves doing risky things because it's thrilling and fun, driving a car fast, jumping out of an airplane and doing parachuting, things that have a lot of risk involved. Part of that is they enjoy the dopamine surge that their brain gets and kind of this feeling of almost grandiosity that they can get from that surge of dopamine. When people are in a new romantic relationship, they'll often get a surge of dopamine in their brain, and there's kind of that 6-month period, romantic period, that often people are in with relationships where they just feel wonderful. In fact, I've certainly seen that in people throughout my lifetime, where they kind of bounce from relationship to relationship, and they're all under 2 years, and they start off really wonderful, and they're just extremely happy for 6 months, and then gradually they just get back to being who they were again, and they realize, oh, I know what the problem is, you. And so they try again. And again, with dopamine, I mean, right now, when I look at my medical journals, when I look at the kinds of things that are being highlighted as we have to change them right now in our medical system, it's opiate abuse and substance abuse. It's one of the reasons we're getting in a meditation instructor, and it's being paid for by a grant, as they've shown this is actually a way that will work with that. Well, why would meditation help someone who's a substance user? Well, part of the reason people use substances is dopamine, because when they take a narcotic substance that makes them feel wonderful, part of the reward they get is a surge in dopamine in their brain. It just makes them feel wonderful. Well, let's give them an alternative way of having a dopamine surge. We can do it with meditation. Give them something helpful to be addicted to. It's not a bad addiction to have. I often was struck by that. Master Yogananda even said that the more you meditate, the more you want to meditate. Well, and of course that's going to be the case, because you get this surge of neurochemicals that really make you feel like what your potential is, not just where you are right now. Let's talk a little about our genetic material. I think for all of us, we were educated over the years in thinking of our DNA as basically something we are born with. It stays largely immutable or unchanged throughout our lifetime. Maybe you get a little degradation of it. Maybe you're exposed to a toxic chemical and maybe it hurts your DNA a little bit, or you get exposed to too many x-rays and that hurts your DNA a little bit. But largely your DNA goes through your whole lifetime unchanged. Now we know that's not the case. I look at some of the great misunderstandings we've had in medicine that have been debunked in the last 30 years, and it's kind of astounding how strongly people thought these things, particularly that DNA is unchangeable. Well, it turns out a couple of things about our DNA I should make comments on. First one is that it's possible to have DNA that is biologically younger than your chronological age. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, it turns out much of the health of our DNA and its ability to replicate, remember, our DNA are these double helix spirals of genetic material like that, 2 strands wrap around each other like that, and there's end caps, cap on each end called a telomere. The telomeres are really important because if they're long and really chubby, When it comes time for that cell to replicate and create daughter cells, and each one of the cells in your body, most of them have about a 25 replication lifespan. They're going to replicate that many times. And the healthier the telomeres are, the more replications you get that are completely error-free. So what happens is the telomeres relax, they allow these two strands to come apart, so now we've got two freestanding strands, and they replicate, and now we have two double helixes next to each other with nice healthy end caps, these telomeres on them. Well, one of the things that's been discovered is that, for example, if you take a teenager who lives in a very violent setting, you know, they're raised in a crime-ridden area of Chicago, let's say, and at age 18 you measured their telomere length, the average telomere length, it would actually look more like someone who was 40 years old, chronologically. And yet they're only 18. Well, that was kind of the first question that got answered was biological and chronological age the same? And by the way, the cost of figuring out this biological age thing by looking at telomere lengths or measuring the enzyme telomerase in your bloodstream is becoming cheaper and cheaper. Within a decade, it's just going to be part of a routine physical where, you know, you get your cholesterol results, your blood sugar, and here's your biological age. So it's actually going to give us a nice piece of feedback on what we're doing. We're going to actually be able to compare ourselves and see, I'm aging a year at a time, but am I aging more slowly biologically by my lifestyle? Well, what they found was that if you're meditating, that actually your DNA begins looking biologically younger. In fact, about 5 years ago, a reporter from the Times of India, of all places, was interviewing me on my medical practice. And they were kind of interested because they knew I took care of a great many yogis, people who actually practiced meditation on a regular basis. And they were curious how their health was different. And I was trying to think for a moment on what kinds of things I saw, and I said, you know, one thing I've noticed, well, actually two things I've noticed. One is that everybody looks about 10 years younger. When I look at them physiologically, they always seem about 10 years younger than the age that's listed on their chart. Guess what? Studies just coming out right now. On average, long-term meditators meditated more than 1,000 hours. Their biological age is about 7.5 years younger than their chronological age. So that's actually been backed up by changes that we can see in telomeres. That was just kind of my off-cuff comment on that. One other thing that's kind of interesting with this is that our mitochondria, the energy-producing structures in our cells, those are actually, they have their own DNA and they duplicate separately, and we only get our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers. So you can thank mom for your mitochondria and for your attitudes about right and wrong, because most of us got our ideas of right and wrong by about age 7, usually from mother. There's a whole field now called epigenetics, or called epigenetics or epigenics, either one. And this has been the understanding that many of the genes that are in our DNA, they turn out to be variable. They're not permanently fixed. They can be changed. And lifestyle, positive lifestyle changes can result in these genes being switched off or changed to a different level of function. Well, does that persist? Like if you have children, does that mean your children are going to get this gene in the changed position? The answer is yes. In fact, when they've studied it in laboratory animals, where they've worked with a group of mice to change some of their epigenes so that they're in a different position by doing lifestyle things with mice, They'll actually find 14 generations later, they can still see that change in the offspring mice. That's a kind of echoing we get. It's sort of what we do now echoes in eternity, and some of that is through our genetic material, and that's part of what we pass on to our offspring. Right now, if I look at my Medicare population, my patients that are age 65 and older, roughly half of them have high blood pressure, and about 40% of them have prediabetes or diabetes. This is a great place for us to be introducing meditation, because these are both conditions that can be influenced by direct effects on these epigenetic factors. And it's one way of trying to get their genetic material to be cooperative with them not having high blood pressure and not being diabetic. I think the two things I'd like to end with is, first one is the role of inflammation in disease. In fact, this is, when I look again at my medical journals, what am I seeing talked about in every single issue? It's how inflammation is now seen to underlie many different medical conditions, and it goes over many different areas of healthcare. So they found that forms of depression are caused by inflammation in the nervous system. Parkinson's disease, it's an inflammatory process. Multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, is an inflammatory process. Rheumatoid arthritis, an inflammatory process. High blood pressure, inflammatory process. Diabetes, inflammatory process. You've heard what I've said, it's inflammatory. In fact, when you look at cardiovascular disease, I have dozens and dozens of patients with cholesterols that would be considered elevated, and they're in their late 70s, and they're perfectly healthy, and they're not on any medication for that, and they will probably die from something else, not heart disease. So does high cholesterol cause heart disease? Well, the answer is it can be involved, and you're at higher risk if you have more cholesterol. But the key seems to be an underlying process of inflammation. Well, we're lucky. We have this incredible tool that can work with inflammatory processes, and that is meditation, particularly if you take it with a lifestyle that's moderate in your other lifestyle habits, and really avoiding things that are unhealthy, like smoking or drinking alcohol, that are clearly unhelpful and inflammatory in and of themselves. In fact, I think you could say that someone who meditates and has a lifestyle of service and is eating moderately, exercising, kind of doing the things that are going to promote good health, they dramatically lower their risk for any of these inflammatory conditions, really can kind of help keep them at bay. You may be a little surprised to hear this, but for example, with depression now, we are exploring using anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen as a treatment for depression because it works. Isn't that curious? You wouldn't think about a mental health condition being made better by something you'd take for a muscular ache. But again, in many people, there's this inflammatory component underneath. Not surprising, a powerful anti-inflammatory process like regular meditation is going to help with that. Last thing I'd like to talk about, I'm not going to go into the intestinal microbiome today. I just feel like there's so much in the news about that right now, I won't add on to that, other than it is a key player in our overall health. But I would like to talk briefly about exosomes, because I think you're going to hear about these in the next few years. What we've discovered is there are many different ways for cells in our body to communicate with the rest of your body, aspects of your health. And exosomes are tiny little spherical structures that some cells will create. They're covered in fat, so they'll travel throughout your bloodstream quite safely and not get eaten up by your white blood cells. But they can send messengers, information throughout your body. Well, why is that important? Well, it turns out exosomes are a surprisingly important way your body communicates information. For example, if you take mice and you get them really fit so they can run on their little exercise wheels all day quite happily, and you take their blood, take out exosomes from their blood, that's all you're going to take. You're going to leave everything else behind, just the exosomes, and put those in unfit mice. Those unfit mice suddenly are able to exercise the way the fit mice can. So there's some factor that's being taken around the body that is very potent, that is being transmitted by these little spherical transmitters that have protein in them. And they found that diabetes, that maybe some of the effects of diabetes are being caused by exosomes that get released as your blood sugars are out of control. So again, we're always looking at ways we can work with something like meditation to mitigate these things. And this may be one of the ways we're doing it, is creating healthy exosomes that are communicating with our body. And that may be something that can be, well, I think we're going to learn more about. For example, another case of that is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Any of you who've watched these studies on professional football players who've had repeated head injuries, they get this syndrome called CTE, where they get depressed and suicidal. I mean, it's a really horrific disease. Their brains just look like they've been eaten up by a parasite when you look at them after death. Well, it turns out that if you take an animal that has had a brain injury and just let them go through the normal process, and then compare them to an animal where they've had the brain injury, but you take all the exosomes out of their bloodstream, they have much, much less evidence of traumatic change in their brain and the more systemic effects of brain injury, because these exosomes are, the problem with the exosomes are mitigated. So I think you're probably going to hear with meditation the discussion of exosomes coming up in the next decade. And I wanted to make sure I sort of got you ready for that, because it's something no one talks about. I didn't even know what an exosome was the first time I read about it. I had to go look it up. And so I think that's something that you'll find coming. You know, I think I'd just like to conclude by saying it is remarkable. We really have been engineered for divinity. And I just look back 40 years ago and thinking, well, it sure seems like meditation works, but how do you get beyond your genetic material? You know, if you come from a family that was alcoholic or depressed or anxious, or you were born with a tendency toward diabetes or high blood pressure, well, it's nice you can meditate, but, you know, we've got this huge impediment of all these physical processes that we don't seem to be able to change. By age 25, our brain is fixed and won't change anymore. And basically what we're seeing is, boy, there is cause for great hope, even physiologically, where long, healthy lives with regular meditation, I think, should be what we expect for all of us and for the future of humankind. I did make one book recommendation. If anybody, I always get asked about this, so I thought I'd just make it. This is actually a very good book by Richard Davidson from University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's as of about 2016, the state of meditation research. And it's very good. He goes into many of the topics I did here today. So not a bad one if you like to see graphs and a lot of information and all the acronyms. They're all in there. So very good. Thank you.